Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Roto Curve video series. I, of course, am Ricky Sanders, actually broadcasting from my childhood bedroom. So that's why you see the bowling trophies in the background, my Indiana banners, you see the Bears. This is actually where I grew up. I'm at my parents' house after the holiday. But enough about me, because the star of the show, as always, of course, Jim McCormick. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Like we were talking before the show, it's that week. It's finally here. We've talked about this forever, but it's like the prom's finally here. You know,
Exactly.
No one wants to see us in a dress, though. But it's time. It's time to go.
Yeah, it's a busy week for both of us. We've both been talking. I think we are both propelled right now by coffee or Red Bull or jet fuel or whatever it is that's unnatural flowing through both our veins. But before we get to business with the running backs for week one, let me tell you about a promotion here at Roto Curve. Just enter Curve in the coupon code during checkout and pay only $5 for a weekly premium membership. Now, what does this membership get you? Exclusive position rankings, projections, premium cheat sheets for week one of the NFL season, which we are going to need very soon. Must-have DFS tools like DVP rankings, points per attempt, that kind of good stuff. Optimized DFS tools for DraftKings and FanDuel, which, of course, we will both be trying to win $1 million this week, and access to player ownership percentage analysis after kickoff. Premium members receive everything I just mentioned and more each week. Again, use coupon code CURVE, pay $5 instead of $7. That will get you, a few extra cheeseburgers at McDonald's, basically for free. $1.29 each, I believe they are. So there you go with that. Jim, let's talk running backs for week one, because it is an interesting week. We know that there are a lot of studs that a lot of people are going to be on. So let me ask you, what is your general strategy at running back this week?
This week, I just feel like there's a couple guys that are underpriced based on, the early pricing set up by these sites, particularly DraftKings. Like, for example, Spencer Ware, they couldn't have predicted, Jamal Charles' lingering injury. Maybe they could have. He's coming off an ACL injury, but the market was pretty forgiving on Charles, I feel like throughout the whole summer, and it kind of crashed this last 3 weeks as more news came out. Like Adam Tesher of ESPN recently has been saying, Jamal Charles might not play. Coach Andy Reid today said that, it'll be a stretch for Charles to play. Spencer Ware is 5,400 on FanDuel, 4,400 on DraftKings. I mean, he's just a steal. He had 101 total yards and 2 touchdowns against the Chargers last November. Sarkandrick West is dinged up with an elbow. I mean, Niall Davis made the roster almost exclusively because of that. So that's an awesome one. I think he could be just a cash play and kind of a GPP guy. I mean, the crowd will be on him, but he's the kind of guy who, even though he doesn't catch a lot of balls, is a guy that I would build around.
Yeah, it's an interesting week. I started to look at rosters. I've been building my, cash lineup that I pretty much use both on Fantasy Draft and DraftKings. Are pretty similar in terms of pricing, so it makes it easy. And I think you could go the route of spending up at the running back position. And if you're going to do that, you kind of it looks like, when I was building rosters this week, that it's your choice is spending up at tight end or running back one. And the question is, which do you prefer? And I think this week, my preference with some of these mid-tier backs is to spend up at tight end. So that leaves me without the likes of guys that I really like this week. I mean, I think Ezekiel Elliott's going to be featured for the Cowboys. I think he's in play. I think if I were spending up for one guy in cash games, it would be Todd Gurley in a game that I think the Rams are going to totally control against Blaine Gabbert. They just have a superior defense. We know Gabbert doesn't really hang on to the ball, so I think they're going to have the ball a lot. I think it should lead to a big game from Gurley, who produced against them last year. But I just don't think the upper echelon running back tier is one I'm going to dive into this week with elite wide receivers in great spots. And we know these sites are PPR. And I think there are some mid-tier backs. So is there a guy upper echelon price that you like? Or are you going to be focusing on that mid-tier like me?
No, I agree with you in the sense that the upper tier backs really don't convert that well. They don't play that well in terms of high floor. I mean, they do in the sense that they're upper echelon backs. They're 20 carry guys. But, for example, Doug Martin, for much less, I can get Sims. He's 8th rated on RotoCurve's, RB rankings that you can check out on the site. There's a lot of great NFL tools that I use when I'm building lineups. No, I kind of agree with you. This is a week to pay up for tight end. It's a week to get Jordan Reed in there. It's a week to get, obviously, to consider Gronk. I mean, we haven't heard much on Gronk, but, for example, Arizona has had issues against the tight end for years now. But, yeah, no, Gurley obviously is the guy just in terms of volume and the idea that look, I'm an Eagles fan, so I know all about Chip Kelly and how quickly his offenses get off the field. And, Blaine Gabbert plus Chip Kelly means a lot of 3-and-outs, which means a lot of Todd Gurley. And then, Doug Martin is a guy, though. He's similar to Gurley in that sense, 25 touches per game last year against Atlanta. But I just don't really like the upper tier. I mean, Lamar Miller, honestly, has the most cost certainty to me besides, Todd Gurley. If I'm paying up, he's a guy who's going to get 20-plus touches. And of all the guys we just talked about, he's the most realistic to get 5 catches.
Yeah, I like that strategy, and we could get to that in tournaments because I do think spending up for backs is the way to go in tournaments. And we discussed on a different video that I actually keep coming back to that Brock Osweiler, Lamar Miller stack is a way to go for that millie. I will have a lineup in the Millionaire Maker with both those guys and hope for that long reception against this pretty crappy Bears defense, to be quite honest with you. But the reason I'm comfortable not spending up at back are these mid-tier guys who I think are going to get the same volume or at least similar in pretty awesome matchups. And let me start with Latavius Murray. And this isn't a guy that I like for the year, mind you. I keep having to write that I don't like this guy. I really think DeAndre Washington eventually is going to eat into his workload, but he got the full workload last year, and he's going to open the season against the Saints team that allowed the most yards per carry last year. They were just a bad defense all around. Actually, let me put that back. No, they did allow the most yards per carry and the second most total rushing yards. So I was right there. They did add guys like Nick Fairley, Laurinaitis, and Craig Robinson to the defense, but I don't think this, catapults them to the upper echelon of run defenses or anything like that. We know about this elite offensive line, and even though I like David Carr, this is a big total for the Oakland team. I think Murray gets that full workload. I don't think he'll catch very many passes, which is, somewhat of a downside. But I do think for 10,400 on Fantasy Draft that this is a guy who's got, that same kind of upside as Todd Gurley with that kind of workload against a poor opponent. It's kind of a similar game script, to be honest with you, except for the fact that, the Saints should compete. And so both teams will have to throw throughout the course of the game. Maybe the Rams get up and they just run it out at the end. That might be an advantage to Gurley, but he also costs a lot more. So I think Latavius Murray is one of my favorite backs. And I'm going to throw another one out before I get back to you, and that's D'Angelo Williams at 10,000. I mean, we talk about guys with elite workloads that'll catch passes too. Another one the pricing algorithm really couldn't have known is that Le'Veon Bell suspension was – it happened, then it didn't happen, then it did happen again, but shorter. But he's out, and we're talking about a guy in D'Angelo Williams. I have the numbers here, 24.74 fantasy points in the games in which he touched the ball 18-plus times. In fact, he failed to reach 16.6 fantasy points just once out of 7 games in which he did that. And, of course, most of that came without Le'Veon Bell. So we're talking about a guy with a pretty safe floor, maybe the safest floor of any back, honestly, even including the studs. And he's priced like a mid-tier guy. So I think, using him instead of Gurley and spending it elsewhere is kind of a wise move because I think these guys have similar kind of projections. What say you?
No, I agree with you with the idea that let's take a discount on the upper echelon of running backs, but try to seek out the same profile. Like what's drawing us to Gurley? Let's go to Murray. And speaking of Laurinaitis, this is just my defensive player nerd. He had the lowest stop percentage in the league last year in terms of tackles made on the field, so he's not really going to be much of a plugger there. And I think there's a reason that Nick Fairley keeps bouncing around. But to that point, I like Rashad Jennings, actually. I think there's potential. If the season long, if the hesitance with him is he's 31, he's not going to hold up, well, you don't have to worry about that, at least for week 1. You're not taking a long play on him. You're just looking at week 1. Dallas is another team, talking about the Saints depleted in the middle. They've had issues, all year. Randy Gregory is suspended. Rolando McClain suspended. Greg Hardy's not back, obviously. they really don't have a defensive tackle worthy of mentioning. Sean Lee is their best run stopper, and he's an outside linebacker. Anthony Hitchens is an undersized inside linebacker. I just don't think there's really much there for stopping the run. And I think when you saw McAdoo get more control of the offense last year in that final 4 games, Jennings was getting the ball at that workhorse rate, and he also catches the ball. And now there's a report coming out, whether it's Narrative Street or it's coach speak, he's getting the ball at the goal line is the idea. And really, with Andre Williams getting cut, it's only Paul Perkins and Shane Vereen on the depth chart. So I think there's a real possibility that Rashad Jennings kind of mimics RB1 workload, and he's coming in at a price when the price was set. I think that's the theme that we're going at here, is that a lot of these are kind of inefficiencies set up by the timing, and that we might not always have these. If Jennings is going to get 23 touches and 5 catches, he'll be more expensive next week. But I think it's good to capitalize on that now. And using the Vegas trend idea, the Latavius Murray thing, big over-under in that game. Same thing with this Giants-Cowboys game, point total around 50, even with, Dak Prescott.
Yeah, and that one's turned into a pick'em, which is interesting. So it's supposed to be a close game all the way through, which, of course, bodes well for Jennings as opposed to them falling behind and relying on Vereen. So you got to like that. I do think he gets more of the workload this year, so I'm on board there. Here's a guy I keep falling back onto, and I'm wavering on whether or not I feel like he's a cash play, because I think everyone's going to be on Spencer Ware rightfully. I mean, a guy with a full workload, goal line, the whole 9 yards in a good matchup. But how about Duke Johnson in week number 1? Now, I think that the feeling that most people are getting out of Brown's camp is that, they want to pound the ball now. That's, after it was like earlier in the preseason, Hugh Jackson was saying, this guy's an extreme weapon, I think was his exact words, excuse me, on Duke Johnson. Now he's been saying, well, we want to pound the ball, and that seems to favor Crowell. But let's not forget that this Eagles team, mind you, like you mentioned, they were on defense for longer than any team last year, so their numbers are a little skewed. But this was a team who allowed a healthy amount of receptions to opposing backs. I think it was the 10th most receptions. And Duke Johnson caught 61 passes last year. Griffin III's got a decent offensive line, not great, but, under pressure, he's going to be looking for some safety blankets. And I think Duke Johnson makes all the sense in the world. I think this is a guy who's going to, even the beat writer said he should approach 70 catches this year. And I think from the start, he's going to get a solid opportunity. I think Duke Johnson catches, 5 to 7 passes in the opening week, and that's as good as 50 to 70 rushing yards on its own. So, we underrate these guys who are receiving backs, and people want to call them tournament-only options like the Darren Sproles and things like that. But I think when it's a matchup conducive to them catching passes, it's like rostering a Jarvis Landry or someone like that who relies on pass catching. And I think this is a matchup that Duke Johnson should be able to take advantage of, and he's really cheap everywhere. So I kind of like him everywhere. I'll probably focus on him mostly in tournaments, but I am wavering back and forth on rostering him in cash games. Is there anyone else in that similar price range that you like?
Well, when you think I really like Duke Johnson the season long. He was a guy I loved all summer. Admittedly, there's been a kind of a market shift. People liking Crowell more recently. One interesting study, just for viewers to consider. I think it was RotoViz. I don't know. There was a really cool study basically about rushing quarterbacks and how it affects PPR running backs, and that any quarterbacks who have a 1-to-4 ratio of rushing to passing, that it's generally a negative correlation for receiving backs. Just the idea that, so in a single game like that, I actually agree. I think that the Eagles pass rush could play into them doing a lot of dump-offs and screens, but it'll be interesting to see, because I don't remember RG3, maybe because he was with Alfred Morris. I just don't remember him having a great rapport, so it could be an issue. Maybe, we can think of a bet this week on Twitter for Duke Johnson. But I completely get the theory behind it, because we have to remember that these games are really friendly for receiving backs. Speaking of that, I like Charles Sims in that same kind of mold. I mentioned before, he's the 8th rated, back on the RotoCurve DFS metrics. The thing that I really like about him is the Falcons gave up 118 receptions to running backs last year. It's the most in the league. Again, we shouldn't focus too much on last year, but it's really a personnel issue. They drafted a rookie linebacker, Deion Jones, out of LSU. He's a speedster, but still, they still have Paul Warrilow in there in inside reps. long story short, not even to worry about names, they don't have a very good front seven, and it's going to be kind of leaky in the flats, and I think that could really help out Charles Sims. The other thing with Sims is he's not one of these guys who only thrives on receptions. He had 125 carries last year. So he's the kind of guy who can get 10 to 13 touches. He averaged 62 yards from scrimmage against the Falcons last year. So I actually think he's one of these guys who has a high floor at a low price.
There you go. I just want to mention one guy in the higher tier before we go a little bit lower, and that's Mark Ingram in that same game as Latavius Murray. I think, that was a guy who was targeted a lot more last year and just became a lot more valuable. And he's one of those guys sitting a tier below the studs that I think has that similar kind of upside. That is a guy that I would go for if you're comfortable spending down a tight end. If you're comfortable with the likes of Delaney Walker, Dwayne Allen, one of those kind of guys, I think Ingram makes sense in order to move up from, someone who's a little unsure like Duke Johnson. So I just wanted to throw that out there. But let's go to the tournament guys now, and I'm going to go with the one cheap guy that really stands out to me, and he's basically Duke Johnson, except way older and way smaller. How about Darren Sproles? This is the guy I just can't get out of, but the reports lately have been that this guy is going to be featured in the offense, and why not? I mean, for a young quarterback who's going to be under pressure, I mean, their matchup week 1 isn't exactly screaming pressure, but still, this is a kid who's learning the games right now really quick to him. It's got to slow down. But Sproles is going to be there to help him out. I mean, he's a quick guy out of the backfield who can beat all linebackers, and I think he's 7,400 on Fantasy Draft, which is just, it's like 2,000 cheaper than Marvin Jones. It's 3,000 cheaper than any other back that we've really been talking about. So it is way down there. And this is a guy who scored – it's pretty quiet. I mean, I had to look this up. At least 7 touchdowns in 3 of his last 5 years. So that's a pretty substantial amount for a guy who's tiny, who needs to really break one. But for tournaments, he's a speedster. If he catches one and he busts one, it's likely going to be, a long touchdown. They're not going to give him many goal line looks. So I think Darren Sproles has got that high catch upside with a guy with Wentz who's just looking for anyone to help save his life in his first start, which is usually how it goes for these rookie quarterbacks. So I think Sproles has some serious catch upside. If it breaks right, you got yourself a cheap gem. There's a guy I'm going to be focusing on. Again, he's like a Jarvis Landry type in the backfield.
No, I like that one a lot, actually. Not actually. I just like it a lot. Thinking of like a bet with you, I would actually think that Sproles could outscore Duke Johnson in fantasy points. I wouldn't even be surprised. This sounds crazy, but I wouldn't be surprised if CJ Spiller's in that same conversation. I know you just talked about Ingram, but Spiller was second in the league among running backs in targets per route. When he's out there, he is going to get passes. But my GPP guy is a guy who actually doesn't get any catches, which is interesting. But it's just this is literally just seeing if the awakening is real. It's all the Twitter hype. It's seeing if, just today, Kristen Michael is listed ahead of Thomas Rawls on the depth chart. I'm not entirely sure that it really speaks to the season plans, but I think it does speak to the immediacy of the fact that Rawls is really slow to come back from this injury. He had 1 preseason carry. Up and through the first 3 games, Kristen Michael was leading the NFL in rushing yards in the preseason. I just think they're going to give this guy the shot. I mean, they've had a vested interest, a narrative interest in this guy ever since they drafted him. I know they let him go to Dallas last year, but, all of the factors we talk about, if you follow Spark scores, he's a Spark freak. He's a super athlete, all the highest percentiles, 99th percentile in broad jump, all that goofy, draft Nick nerd stuff that we love. Long story short, I could see them, look, the Dolphins are traveling 3,000 miles to Seattle with a bad defense who, was tough against the run, was a sieve against the run last year, even with Sue in there. And I don't think that's going to change. So there's a real possibility, the way that you said Todd Gurley could get a busy second half, I think that could happen for Kristen Michael. I think you could see like 15 touches in the second half and just a GPP kind of thing where he breaks a big run or two and, low ownership, even, just because he doesn't have the receiving quality. I don't think the crowd will be on him. And I just think there's the possibility that he tops 20 fantasy points for really cheap.
There you go. Couple names I want to mention at the end before we get off. If you're, like you said, projecting game flow, how about if the 49ers get behind the Rams? We start seeing Sean Drawn, who's listed as number 2, getting some of the passes. If you really think it's going to be a blowout and Carlos Hyde may not have to play the whole game, then drawn for extremely cheap could be worth a shot. And another team that's allowed a lot of receptions, and we didn't even really mention him amongst the top guys, but I really think David Johnson has a chance to be the RB1 for the season this year. You look at that Patriots team, they're not going to be controlling the ball like usual without Tom Brady. So David Johnson, we said we were going to save him for tournaments, these top backs. I don't think he's got the world's highest floor, but I do think he has one of the highest ceilings amongst all the backs this week. So while I prefer guys like D'Angelo Williams in cash games, I want David Johnson's potential for both a long run and long catch in tournaments. If we're talking about Millie Maker, I would much rather roster him than Gurley, who I think is going to come in a much higher percentage. And I actually think he's got the higher ceiling. So any final words at the running back position that we didn't cover?
No, we'll just figure out what the bet is for C.J. Spiller versus Duke Johnson. So
that is a good call. I'd be willing to bet you my avatar on that one. I'd probably be willing to bet you sending you some food. Maybe we'll exchange something like that. But you come up with a bet, I'd be willing to bet something of value for it because I really do like Duke Johnson this week. I understand the point, but I am way on him this week. Before we end, let me just review. Again, use promo code CURVE in the coupon box on RotoCurve, this fine website of ours. Exclusive rankings, projections, cheat sheets, tools like DVP, points per attempt, optimized DFS lineups. You get rankings from me and Jim and all the other wonderful writers on the site. Access to player ownership. Again, that'll save you $2. You could get yourself two. How much are nuggets at McDonald's these days? How much can you get for $1?
I don't know. I don't eat those things, but probably like $1.50, maybe less. It's the dollar menu. Well,
I'd be willing to bet you about 18 of those on the Duke Johnson versus CJ Spiller bet. We could go for a year supply of Big Macs or something like that.
Figure it out.
Exactly. That is all for us this time. Stay tuned as we will be back soon with the wide receivers that we like this week. Good luck in NFL week number 1.